Few Americans know about the 1885 trial of Canada's Louis Riel. Partly this is because Americans are woefully ignorant about the history of our neighbors to the north. But nearly every Canadian knows about the Riel trial. It is of great symbolic importance to Canadians. And more than that, it is a trial that significantly shaped the history of the country. In the 1800s, Louis Riel became the charismatic leader of the Métis. The Métis are the mixed-race descendants of unions between, most often, French or British men and women from the Cree, Ojibwe, and other native peoples. In the 19th century, the Métis lived mostly in areas where there was considerable racial mixing due to the fur trade. They developed a distinct culture in central and western Canada. Among the Métis, there was an important distinction between French Métis, born usually of voyageur fathers, and the Anglo-Métis, with English or Scottish fathers. The French Métis spoke French, practiced Catholicism, and generally led the nomadic life of hunters or trappers. The English Métis spoke English, were Protestants, and generally lived on farms. Riel was French Métis, with a father of Franco-Ojibwe descent and a white mother. By modern standards, the 1885 Northwest Rebellion, which Louis Riel led, seems no big deal. Canadian forces easily put down the uprising of a couple hundred Métis settlers along the South Saskatchewan River. A majority of Métis in the region did not participate in the fighting. Only 100 or so persons died in the conflict. The importance of the Northwest Rebellion and the trial of Louis Riel comes from its symbolism and the tensions they reveal. Tensions that continue to distinguish Canada, East versus West, Native versus non-Native, and French-speaking versus English-speaking. At the same time, both the rebellion and Riel's trial should be understood as the product of a particular place and time. The place was the Canadian frontier, and the time was one of conflict between European civilization and the traditions of an indigenous people. Riel might be the most complicated, elusive, puzzling, and controversial figure in Canadian history. A look at the chapter titles of Albert Braze's 2003 book, The False Traitor, Louis Riel in Canadian Culture, suggests the many and disparate ways in which Riel has been seen. The Red River Patriot, the traitor, the martyr, the go-between, the mystic madman. Riel was born in 1844 into a devout Catholic family in a settlement on the Red River in present-day Winnipeg. Although of 7/8 white ancestry, Riel considered himself a Métis. Back in Saskatchewan, meanwhile, things were not going well for the Métis. Canadian government surveyors were redrawing plots on the land that the Métis had settled. Most disturbingly, the surveyors divided the land into square lots. Traditionally, Métis lived on lots that were long rectangles, bordering rivers. The Métis system allowed more Métis farmers river access, and it made it possible to have homes close together along the riverfront. Anger over these land issues reached the boiling point in the summer of 1884, and the Métis chose to send a delegation to travel to Montana. The delegation's mission? Convince the only man who could save their cause to come back to Canada. Riel was expecting them. A month earlier, he had received a letter from Métis friends that said, "The whole race is calling on you." The Métis delegation pleaded with Riel. "We need you," they said. "We need you to advocate for better treatment for the Métis." Riel accepted the call. He packed up and headed north to the small river town of Batoche. Once there, he busied himself drafting and sending to Ottawa a petition of grievances for both white and the Métis residents. The government basically brushed him off. It offered only a few minor concessions that did nothing to reduce the agitation. By March of 1885, Riel felt radical action was necessary. So he called a meeting in a local church. And in the meeting, he asked for a vote on setting up a provisional government, which Riel proposed to call the ex ovidate, from Latin meaning out of the flock. He told the crowd that the time had come to take up arms against the Canadian government. He had another announcement as well. In the new government, there would be a new church under a new pope, Bishop Bourget of Montreal. Riel told his followers that God would help the members of his flock. They were the new chosen people. And he then performed a ritual in which he breathed the Holy Spirit into each person who declared support for his cause. But back east, authorities were not amused. The first violence of the 1885 Northwest Rebellion erupted when a Métis party on a mission to a general store encountered two Mounties. The Métis rebels chased the two Mounties as they raced to rejoin their unit. And as the Métis band fired shots over their heads, the Mounties retreated. More recruits joined the rebels in time for a second encounter with Mounties near Duck Lake. And when the rebels met the Mounties drew their sleighs into a defensive circle. Two rebels approached the Mounties under a white flag. But things didn't work out well. The Mounties fatally shot both men. And this ignited a firefight that left 12 Mounties and 5 rebels dead. With the casualties, Riel had crossed a line. Whatever small hope there might have been to achieve a compromise and concessions was gone. When word of the violence reached Prime Minister MacDonald, he ordered 2,000 troops west. They would travel over the still uncompleted rail lines of the Canadian Pacific. And here just a word about those rail lines. In 1885, large gaps still existed in the railroad between Toronto and the Canadian West. The troops sent by MacDonald traveled by foot and sleigh from one segment to the other. Some historians have attributed MacDonald's non-responsiveness to Métis complaints to his interest in building support among the public to finish the rail line. Support the troops, build the railroad. For people who buy this conspiracy theory, Riel died to save a railroad that now stretches from sea to shining sea. At any rate, by rail and other means, the Canadian troops, led by Major General Frederick Middleton, made it to within 170 miles of Batoche when they learned that 9 whites had been massacred at Frog Lake earlier in the month. Tensions were sky high. The troops encountered their first fighting near Fish Creek, where Middleton was marching his men north towards Batoche. About 200 rebels hid in a ravine, hoping to ambush the soldiers as they passed through. But a scout foiled the plan when he spotted the rebels in the woods. The Canadian troops moved to higher ground and from there they could fire down into the woods at the rebels. When the fighting was over, 6 Canadian soldiers were dead and another 49 wounded. The rebels lost 4 men and dozens of horses. That climatic battle between the badly outnumbered rebels and Middleton's troops occurred on May 9th near the rebel-held town of Batoche. Knowing that rebels were pinned down and low on ammunition, General Middleton was content to let the fighting drag on for days. When it finally became apparent that the rebels' ammunition was all but gone, the troops charged. Many rebels, including Riel, fled into the woods in face of the advancing troops. But 3 days later, understanding that his cause was now hopeless, Riel surrendered. He hoped that a public trial might draw attention to the struggle of the Métis people for justice. Meeting his enemy captive for the first time, Middleton described Riel as a mild-spoken and mild-looking man with a short brown beard and an uneasy, frightened look about his eyes, which gradually disappeared as I talked to him. An escort of 16 soldiers transported Riel to the police barracks at Regina. Inspector Richard Dean, concerned about a flood of journalists and Métis sympathizers showing up at his barracks, ordered that no one could visit Riel without a letter from the Prime Minister. He also ordered Riel to carry a ball and chain whenever he entered the yard for fresh air or exercise. In the 8 weeks before his trial, Riel occupied himself writing religious poetry, letters to relatives and friends, and notes about his religious and political movement. Riel pled not guilty to the charge of wickedly, maliciously, and traitorously making war against Our Lady, the Queen, and maliciously and traitorously attempting by force and arms to subvert and destroy the Constitution and government of this realm. The treason charges rested on the 3 Métis battles with the government. Impressive teams of lawyers were assembled for both sides. A 60-year-old Toronto barrister named Christopher Robinson headed the prosecution for the Crown. The defense was led by a 35-year-old Quebec criminal attorney, François Xavier Lemieux, who later became the Chief Justice of Quebec. Assisting Lemieux was Charles Fitzpatrick, who later served as Chief Justice of Canada. Given their client's central role in the rebellion, defense lawyers had little choice but to adopt an insanity strategy. They could point to plenty of evidence showing Riel to be psychologically troubled and maybe a megalomaniac. Riel, after all, told anyone who would listen that he was the New World's prophet. The problem for the defense in the insanity case was proving to 6 jurors that the defendant's mental condition was such that he could not appreciate the wrongfulness of his illegal conduct. Defense lawyers lined up religious leaders and medical experts who could support an insanity defense. They also prepared a brief arguing that Canadian law did not allow a capital case to be decided by a mere 6 jurors. On July 28, 1885, the trial opened in a makeshift courtroom created in the rented offices of a Regina land company. Judge Hugh Richardson rejected each of the contentions in the defense brief, including the argument based on the 6-person jury. The prosecution put on the stand a series of government witnesses who described the leading role Riel had played in the rebellion. John Willoughby testified about Riel's vision of a new government of God-fearing citizens. Thomas Mackay told jurors that Riel described the Canadian government as a curse and urged armed action against it. Thomas Jackson told of Riel giving battle orders. The defense did little to contradict this testimony. Instead, defense lawyers limited cross-examination to questions designed to elicit admissions that Riel was behaving strangely. The prosecution's star witness was Charles Nolan. Nolan was a cousin of Riel and formerly one of his closest associates. He testified that Riel hoped to sow the seeds that would eventually break Canada into a number of separate countries, each to be governed by a distinct ethnic group. Until Nolan testified, Riel sat passively at the defense table, but suddenly he became agitated. He leaped to his feet and demanded the opportunity to put questions directly to Nolan. Now that got Riel's attorney, Charles Fitzpatrick, on his feet. Fitzpatrick begged the court not to allow his client to question the witness. He worried that a skillful cross-examination by his client would undermine the insanity defense. Riel told the court that the insanity defense was not one of his choosing. Quote, "If you will allow me, Your Honor, this case comes to be extraordinary. And while the Crown, with the great talents that they have in its service, are trying to show I am guilty, my counselors are trying to show that I am insane." The argument between Riel and his defense attorney ended only when Judge Richardson explained to Riel the consequence of his asserting his right to cross-examination. It could mean the effective loss of services of his lawyers for all aspects of his case. The defense began its case on the third day of trial. Two priests testified about Riel's peculiar visions and his religious beliefs. Both priests told jurors that they thought Riel was mad. When the defense tried to question the priests about reasons for Matisse' dissatisfaction with Ottawa, the government objected. The prosecution successfully argued that Matisse' complaints, however justified, could not excuse armed action. The issue, they said, was irrelevant in a treason trial. The defense ended its case by calling two expert medical witnesses. One was Dr. Francois Roy, superintendent of the notorious asylum located near Montreal, where Riel had spent nearly 2 years as an inmate. Roy testified that Riel suffered from megalomania and was clearly of an unsound mind. And the second medical witness was Dr. Daniel Clark, superintendent of the more respected Toronto Asylum. Dr. Clark told the jury that he believed Riel had been insane ever since 1865, when he wrote a letter suggesting that he was not really Louis Riel, but a Jew. Testimony ended with the calling of rebuttal witnesses by the prosecution, each of whom recounted conversations with Riel that convinced them that he was not insane. Closing arguments in the case of the Queen versus Louis Riel stand among the most eloquent ever delivered in a Canadian courtroom. Charles Fitzpatrick, for the defense, began his presentation with a short history of the conflict. On November 16, 1885, Riel was escorted from his cell. He prayed with Father André, renounced his heresies, and received absolution. When Father André began weeping, Riel said calmly, "Courage, mon père." With the rope around his neck, Riel and Father André recited together the Lord's Prayer. When they reached the words, "Deliver us from evil," the trap fell. The execution of Louis Riel elevated him to the status of martyr in much of Quebec. Mass rallies took place in Montreal. People throughout the province hung black drapes and displayed other signs of mourning. The Riel execution became a turning point in Canadian politics. Opposition to his execution helped break the conservative hold on French Canada. Riel's concerns and his passions helped define the course of Canadian history. Troubled, ever-transforming Louis Riel remained after death a large figure in the Canadian imagination. Villain or hero, a threat to orderly settlement, or a crusader against a neglectful government and greedy speculators. For many decades, French Canadians largely saw Riel as a hero. English Canadians saw him as a villain. But by the 1960s or so, the views of English Canadians drew closer to the views of French Canadians. Riel, over time, has become less linked to his actual role in history. As Canadian historian Shannon Bauer notes, various groups in Canada now seek to animate their struggles through the transcendent spirit of Louis Riel.